I didn't reach for a weapon, I reached for my tablet. On the screen, grainy infrared shapes moved with the practiced ease of people who thought they owned the night. 3 of them. One was tall and lanky, Trevor, Mara's son, holding a heavy canister of what looked like industrial herbicide. The other 2 were older men, dressed in tactical vests that looked more like a costume than equipment. They weren't there to spray paint this time. They were heading for my century-old oaks with a chainsaw. I didn't shout from the porch. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. Instead, I remotely triggered the new high-intensity LED floodlights I'd rigged into the eaves. The yard exploded into artificial noon. The 3 figures froze, squinting into the blinding white glare. I stepped out of the front door, wearing my old department windbreaker, a thermal mug of coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. I didn't look angry, I looked bored. "You're about 10 feet past the property line, Trevor," I said, my voice carrying easily through the crisp night air. "And those trees are protected under the state's Historical Canopy Act. That's a felony per branch." Trevor sneered, though his hand trembled on the chainsaw's pull cord. "This isn't your land, Cole. My mom found the original survey. You're a squatter on Jennings' soil." "Is that what she told you?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee. "Tell Mara I appreciate the lighting check. The camera's got your faces in 4K. I'll be sure to send the footage to the DA. Now, get off my lawn before I decide to see if my old firefighter's grip still works on trespassers." They retreated, shouting curses that sounded hollow against the massive, silent weight of the manor. But as I watched the taillights fade, I knew the survey Trevor mentioned was the real threat. Mara wasn't just a neighborhood bully, she was a predator with a paper trail. The grand confrontation, as the town later called it, happened 3 days later. It was a Tuesday, the air thick with the smell of incoming rain. I was on a ladder, scraping the last of the thief graffiti off the brick, when a motorcade of authority arrived. 2 county sheriff cruisers, a black SUV, and a white city truck labeled Building Inspection and Code Enforcement. Mara Jennings stepped out of the SUV like she was disembarking from a royal carriage. She wore a sharp navy suit and a smile that felt like a razor blade. Beside her was a man in a rumpled suit carrying a surveyor's tripod. "Mr. Cole," Mara called out, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, "I told you it would be unfortunate. We're here to execute an emergency seizure and demolition order for a non-compliant, hazardous structure." I climbed down the ladder slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I just leaned against the scaffolding. Demolition, that's a bit extreme for a few cracked windows, don't you think? A sheriff's deputy I hadn't met before, a burly man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "Sir, Mrs. Jennings has provided the board with a title search dating back to 1890. It shows a reversionary clause. If the property was ever abandoned for more than 10 years, ownership reverts to the heirs of the original builder. That's the Jennings family." Mara stepped forward, holding a yellowed piece of parchment. It looked remarkably similar to the one I'd found in the basement wall. "My great-grandfather didn't just work here, Mr. Cole. He built it. This house is my birthright. Your $1 auction deed is void because the county had no right to seize it in the first place." The code inspector sighed, looking at the house. "And since the structure has been declared historically unstable by the HOA's private engineer, the city has cleared it for immediate teardown to prevent public liability. I'm sorry, son. You've got an hour to grab your things." Behind Mara, Trevor was filming again, his face a mask of smug triumph. "Post this one, Mom," he whispered. "The end of the squatter." I looked at the deputy. "You're going to let them bulldoze a house based on a piece of paper she brought from her attic?" "It's a notarized historical deed, sir," the deputy said, looking genuinely pained. "The city attorney signed off on the emergency order. My job is just to keep the peace while the crew does their work." I looked at Mara. She was practically vibrating with victory. This wasn't about the house for her. It was about the land underneath it, the development deals, and the sheer ego of never being told no. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand. "Before you start the engine on that backhoe idling at the gate, I have something you should see, since we're talking about bloodlines and original builders." I walked into the house. The silence inside was heavy, expectant. I went to the kitchen table and picked up a heavy, leather-bound folder and the small wooden box I'd found behind the basement bricks. When I stepped back onto the porch, the crowd had grown. A few neighbors, including Tom Murphy and Mrs. O'Leary, had gathered at the gate, watching the execution of Raven Hill. "Mara," I said, standing on the top step, "you said your great-grandfather, Samuel Jennings, built the south wing." "He built the whole foundation," she snapped. "His initials are carved in the basement stone. SJ, it's a matter of record." "I saw the initials," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "but I think you misread them. Or maybe you just saw what you wanted to see." I opened the wooden box and pulled out the locket. I clicked it open. Inside were two portraits. One was a man with a fierce, intelligent gaze and a thick beard. The other was a woman with kind eyes that looked hauntingly like my Laura's. "This is Elias Blackwood," I said, showing the locket to the deputy. "He was the architect. He didn't just build this house, he lived here until 1910. And this," I pulled out the brittle parchment from the basement, "is the actual land grant, signed by the Federal Reconstruction Authority." Mara laughed, a shrill, nervous sound. "So what? A tenant's locket? That doesn't change the reversionary clause." "It does," I said, "when you realize that Elias Blackwood didn't have any Jennings heirs. He had one daughter. She married a man named Cole, my great-great-grandfather." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds in the oak seemed to stop chirping. I opened the leather folder. "I spent the last 48 hours in the state archives, Mara. I didn't just look at the local records you've been bribing people to update. I looked at the federal census and the military pension records. Elias Blackwood was my ancestor. This house didn't revert to the Jennings because it never left the Blackwood-Cole lineage, the abandonment you cited. It was a 3-year gap during the Great Depression when the family lived in the guest house because they couldn't afford to heat the manor. It was never legally abandoned." I stepped down the stairs, closing the gap between me and Mara. She recoiled as if I were a ghost. "But here's the best part," I continued, handing a fresh, embossed document to the deputy. "I filed this yesterday with the State Historical Commission. Because I can prove direct lineage and I've restored the property to its 1873 specifications, Ravenhill Manor has been granted permanent state landmark status. Do you know what that means, Mara?" The deputy's eyes widened as he read the document. He looked at the code inspector, who suddenly looked very interested in his own shoes. "It means," I said, my voice dropping to cold, hard edge, "that this property is now exempt from all local HOA jurisdictions. It also means that any attempt to demolish or modify the structure, like, say, bringing a chainsaw to the trees, is a state-level crime. And since you filed a fraudulent title claim to obtain a demolition order, that's called filing a false instrument and attempted grand theft of real property." Mara's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled purple. You're lying. You're a firefighter from the city. You just happened to buy this house." "I didn't know the connection when I bid that $1, I said, and for the first time I let a small, sarcastic smile touch my lips. I guess Laura was right. The house was just waiting for someone patient enough to listen. It recognized me, Mara, long before I recognized it." The deputy turned to Mara. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the porch. Now, and Mr. Jennings," he looked at Trevor, who was staring at his phone in horror, "stop filming. You're going to want to call a lawyer, not a follower." The aftermath was a slow-motion landslide for the Willow Creek HOA. Once the Jennings bloodline myth was shattered, other neighbors found the courage to speak up. It turned out Mara had been skimming maintenance fees for years to fund her son's lifestyle and her own consulting firm. Within a month, the HOA was disbanded, the board resigned in disgrace, and Mara was facing a slew of civil lawsuits and a very real criminal investigation into the forged deed she tried to use against me. A few weeks later, the house was finally quiet again. The scaffolding was down, the thief paint was gone, and the new glass in the windows caught the sunset like liquid gold. Tom Murphy stopped by with a crate of cedar planks. He didn't say much, just sat on the porch and looked out at the river. "You know," he said, "folks are calling this place the $1 Fortress now." "It's just home, Tom," I replied. I went inside and walked to the parlor. The giant mirror was clean now. I looked at my reflection. I still looked tired. I still had gray in my hair. But the man in the glass didn't look like he was haunted anymore. He looked like he belonged. I ran my hand over the banister, feeling the smooth, ancient wood. I could almost hear the house breathing, a deep, rhythmic pulse of stone and timber. I had lost everything in a fire once. I thought I was spent. But in the dust of Ravenhill, I found out that some things are built to survive. And if you're willing to fight for the past, sometimes the past will give you a future. I picked up my hammer and headed for the basement. There was still work to be done. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't working to forget. I was working to remember.